special edition of Daily Delivery. Michael Rand here. Didn't expect to be doing this on a Monday night, especially at this point in the NHL season, but I've got Sarah McLellan with me right now, a Wild beat writer. Wild fired their head coach today. Dean Evason out. John Hynes in. Interesting development, Sarah. Just kind of feels like, I guess my first instinct is this really escalated quickly, even though it's not terribly surprising when a team has lost 7 games in a row that you would make a coaching change. But it felt like we just went from like, they're off to a little bit of a slow start to, man, this losing streak is getting a little serious, to, hey, they fired Dean Evason 19 games into the season when he had a pretty successful run, at least during the regular season here.
Yeah, there'd even been some ebbs and flows just in this losing streak too, that, it kind of looks like the team switched gears. It obviously started, maybe some hard fought losses against the Rangers and the Sabres on that New York road trip. Then the complete meltdown at home to Dallas right before Sweden. But then it looked like the team, kind of reset in Sweden. There was some competitive losses, 1-goal losses. There was 3 straight 1-goal losses. But then, the team goes to Detroit, and on Sunday, it kind of felt like a step back for them. Progress they'd made, and getting kind of more competitive, cleaning up their own zone, maybe kind of focusing more on the finer details. That looked like it went missing on Sunday, and it was kind of back to square one with some of these issues. The untimely, costly penalties, the penalty kill, giving up goals, and just the offense just drying up at inopportune times, obviously. And so just kind of felt like, they weren't able to close that gap. They weren't finally able to turn the momentum that they had at least been building in their game, not even into a win, but into another step forward. It really kind of felt that they were kind of now then stalled. And obviously then the next day, Monday, Evason is out along with Bob Woods, the longtime assistant on the Wild staff. And in comes John Hynes, and it's right behind the bench for him. The Wild plays Tuesday night at home against St. Louis. And this is actually a pretty pivotal stretch for the team. As grim as it is right now, there is an opportunity for this team to kind of climb out of this rut and maybe make up some ground in the standings. They play 3 in a row against the Central, and obviously prying points away from, your division rivals is a pretty easy way to start to close the gap and get up into one of those playoff positions, or at least get closer. And some of the other teams they're chasing, they're playing these teams coming up. So, there's still an opening here. We'll see now, obviously, if a new voice, a new change in leadership is maybe the spark that kind of maybe gets them back into this picture, gets them back up the standings, but maybe just helps them to regain that competitiveness that just has been missing, I think, pretty much all season long.
After that Detroit game, I'm going to play a clip right now. Dean Evason, the fired head coach, he seemed like he could sense that things were getting worse in that game. Let's run a clip here of Evason after the game.
I think the frustration's turning to, anger, obviously, and hopefully they're angry as we are, and because we've got to change something. It can't just continue to be, it's good effort. We outshot them. We had lots of chances. We're still losing, so we've got to find a way to win.
Now he's saying the frustration is turning to anger. You can tell he's kind of exasperated at this point, and he's probably sensing that, hey, if we don't turn this around soon, he might have even known at that point that his job could be in jeopardy. So you're right. I think that game, I don't know if there was one like defining moment or like straw that broke all this, but it does feel like that kind of step back. But it's also got to be frustrating to him because, it obviously is never just the head coach's fault or, primarily the coach's fault. He just becomes the easiest person to take the blame. Like a lot of their players are underperforming, and how fair is it to say that's on Dean Evason?
But that's been, I think, a really big takeaway right now for the Wild struggles is just the individual performances are not what we're used to seeing from this team. The coaching staff amid this slide before this skid they were tweaking lines. They've been tweaking lines. They revamped the penalty kill, which has obviously been an eyesore, not just this season, but in the past as well. Even trying to change the schedule to get on the ice to try to get, the poor starts were an issue early on.
Right.
Like they were really trying to kind of figure out a solution, obviously, for this. And then again, like you said, it really comes down to what happens on the ice, and the performance so far of many of their star players and their go-to players has just not been at the level that this team is probably set the standard with based on that play. Kaprizov has 6 goals. That is nowhere near to the pace that he'd need to even come close to matching what he, totaled last season and getting to 40. Matt Boldy hasn't scored since he returned from injury. And even, those other players around, maybe the top tier players, that secondary scoring hasn't been there either. Freddie Gaudreau has no goals. Marcus Foligno only has 2. That depth scoring that's really galvanized this team the last few years hasn't been there. And so I think, that's probably where the magnifying glass shifts now, is just, okay, the coaches changed, there's someone new, but can these players really, find a solution to these woes? And, that was something Marcus Foligno said in a text message after the coaching change. He said, it's on us players to get this back on track. And, like I said, there is an opportunity there. The West seems wide open. Obviously, you see the teams at the top, reigning Stanley Cup champion in Vegas. We've seen firsthand in these recent games what the likes of Dallas and Colorado can do, and they look like forces for sure. But, there's still some ground to be made up. And really, though, it's going to take these players, not only just getting production, but I think just the way that we've seen them play, it's looked off, hasn't it?
Yes.
The way Kaprizov has played, he just hasn't looked as dominating on the puck as we're used to seeing him, kind of on the outside, when usually he's right up the middle, he's right around the net, and he's scoring those goals that way by kind of weaving in and out of traffic. And we just haven't seen that. Obviously, we documented Boldy's rut as well. He had that injury, which obviously interrupted, the momentum maybe that he might have been able to generate had he been playing consistently. But these are, as what else, Dean Evason pointed out on Sunday, these players are paid to score goals. They're paid, a lot of money. And I think, aside from the pesky long-term problems of the penalty kill and the power play, I think that the underperformance so far of their offensive leaders has probably been, the biggest takeaway for their early season struggles, which I don't even know if we can still call it early season. We're past Thanksgiving.
It's like you're almost a quarter of the way into the season at this point, 19 games.
This is a persistent problem. And I think that's also really been eye-catching, is that what's plagued the Wild this season, it's been the same thing. Like, it really is boiled down to slow starts, shaky special teams, and now this, underperformance of their top players. It's not like it's been, one game where this was off and next game this was off. It really has been the same issues. And I think that's probably added to the frustration, is that they know what they need to fix, and that fix just hasn't arrived.
Grand Casino would like to take a moment and salute the true football fan. The passion, the hope, the anticipation, that incomparable feeling of winning. Grand Casino would also like to take a moment to remind you that you can find all that anticipation, thrill, and winning at Grand Casino. Grand Casino. Let your story begin.
You're right. I mean, the West does seem pretty open, at least to get into the playoffs. You might only need mid to upper 80s, maybe even just to get into the playoffs. It doesn't seem like there's 8 great teams or even 8 very good teams. So you're right that the opportunity is still potentially there. But this is a team that had over 100 points each of the last 2 years. This is a team that has largely a lot of the same players. Now, you spoke to the underperformance of a lot of these players so far, and that's certainly the biggest culprit, I would say, and maybe some of them are tuning out Evason after a few years behind the bench, and successful years as they might have been, the message does start to wear thin, I'm sure, at some points. But when we start to talk about the other reasons, like they've lost, even if they haven't lost a ton of players, like, is this the cumulative, like, drip of, you lose Matt Dumba, you have to trade Kevin Fiala because of cap stuff. You can't add more players because you're kind of up against it because of the Suter and Parisi buyouts, because of other decisions. You kind of keep the roster intact. Guerin, Bill Guerin, GM, signs Zuccarello, Hartman, and Foligno to extensions right before the year. So you kind of got that core stability, but you've also kind of got this core that maybe is getting a little stale. There's not this kind of new blood in there. Like, what, I guess, how much do we attribute this to just overachieving a little bit in the past and now it's catching up to them? Is that maybe a fair assessment to a certain degree too of what's going on here?
Well, the context is so important because you're right. This is a team that, Dean Evason was overseeing that was missing nearly $15 million of its budget.
Yeah.
That was covering the Zach Parise and Ryan Suter buyouts that, isn't being applied to the roster. So I think that's kind of been looming over everything. And maybe it's the elephant in the room, but it's the reality is that this team is at a disadvantage. And so, still, that doesn't change the organizational philosophy of trying to win. And, they're not in a rebuild, but the math is the math. And so you're right. I think it's even started to trickle in these last few seasons. Kevin Fiala goes, Matt Dumba doesn't return. And you're right. That was probably, really the only regular player that they didn't bring back from last season. Obviously, there was those slew of trade deadline acquisitions, but in terms of like bona fide, solidified long-term roster players, Dumbo is really the only change from last season. And then obviously coming in, Pat Maroon is really the only veteran off-season addition that they made to this roster. And he's fit in well. He's produced, he's, found a niche, I think, on whatever line he's kind of played on, staying true to his style and helping out this team and that veteran 3-time Stanley Cup champion mode. But I think that's what's made this swoon and overall the struggles of the season so baffling is it still pretty much is the same roster. So I think that goes back to then the individual performances, the penalty kills still struggling, the power play still struggling, even though again they had a new voice in charge of that with Jason King coming as an assistant in the offseason. But it really is familiar problems that, continue to cost this team. And so, the buyouts aren't going away. They're going to have that same hit on their books next season. So I really think, regardless, this was probably a crossroads type season for this franchise. And I think this has just amplified that with the fact that they haven't at least been able to maintain the competitiveness that they had last season when they were starting to maybe feel a little bit of the pinch. Fiala was gone.
Right.
So it looked like obviously Dumba wouldn't be able to return. But now, again, so many players in recent years had career years and they had so many 20-goal scorers. And now it's tough to see any players, maybe besides, an Eriksson Ek or, Rossi's come in as a rookie, but, to stay on track and at least come close to matching what they've done in the past. It really does seem like it trends down, to the individual and the player performance. And I guess if you want to look at the upside or the silver lining, then maybe there is a solution to be found. Maybe, the season isn't lost yet if these players can regain that. But I think that's been what's been confusing, aside from these familiar woes, is that the players that performed at, such a high level these last few seasons have just, kind of paled in comparison so far this season.
I know they didn't do any access on Monday night. There's going to be the introduction for new head coach John Hynes tomorrow. I'm sure I'm sure Bill Guerin will talk tomorrow. Before we get to kind of the new guy, just kind of wondering how you think Evason will handle all this. Do you think he'll be? I'm sure he's upset that it ends this way. But how do you think what do you think he's going through his head right now?
I'd also heard from him in a text message, and he had mentioned just, how thankful he was for this opportunity, especially, the fans he acknowledged as being an amazing fan base. He really, I think, can reflect on these last few seasons at the helm of the Wild as a real feather in the cap of his coaching career. Obviously, he came in after Bruce Boudreau was fired as an interim. He was an assistant on Boudreau's staff. And I think he really kind of ushered in a new era of Wild hockey. For so long, this team had its bread and butter as its defense and kind of that trap style and eking out 3-2 wins. And I think eventually, especially last season, they kind of got back to that.
Right.
But not before Evason really implemented this up-tempo, aggressive style. And if you think back to a few years ago, there were some nail-biting, edge-of-the-seat type wins. You remember they had a bunch of rallies. They were kind of kings of the ice when they pulled the goalie. But really, Kevin Fiala took off and became a 30-goal scorer. We saw so many highlight goals from Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Zuccarello. They really had the ice and the opportunity to play that way. And in the Wild, set a franchise record a couple seasons ago in goals under Evason. And so I think it showed a new dimension of what the roster that he had at the time was capable of, what this organization could be. It wasn't just sit back and defend and try to win 2-1. It was just a new wave of hockey. And that really, I think, is in line with today's NHL and so much more goal scoring and the highlights. And everybody wants to see those types of plays made. And I think, obviously, like we mentioned with Fiala's departure and maybe some of the roster construction, they had to find a way to be really stingy in their own end. And we saw that kind of transition back to winning games 3-2, 2-1 last season. They really kind of buttoned up in their own end, and it looked like they were playing playoff style hockey, from the second half on. Obviously, it didn't help them come playoff time because of those special team problems that we've noted. But I think the organization really, went through an evolution under Evason, and it'll be interesting to see now what Hynes comes in and does from that. Obviously the offense, I think, is probably going to be on the hot seat regardless because, that lack of execution has really been part of this losing streak. But can they find their way back to that? Can they have that balance and depth? And can they put 4 or 5 goals, in the net a night? Or is it a shift back to that, kind of identity that this franchise has long had? I think it'll be interesting to see. But for Evason, he was part of that. And he really, I think, obviously the success speaks for itself in the regular season. To have the best season in franchise history under his watch, it'll be interesting to see what's next for him, because, he did all that. Obviously, there was a superstar in Kirill Kaprizov on this roster. Obviously, he had tremendous chemistry with Matt Zuccarello. There were talented players on those teams. They're still here. But I think, obviously, the strategy and how he assembled this team, really is a credit to him and the staff and the work that they put in through those years when the Wild was just starting to kind of maybe feel the pinch of the buyouts. They were in a new era too with Parise and Suter gone. There's been a lot of change over that time, but, the Wild are now in a position where this 7-game slide, this obviously is not a direction the team figured it'd be trending, is acceptable for the team to usher in a change like this. And so that's a lot of, I think, Evason's fingerprints too on this organization, the level that he was able to elevate them to.
What do we know about Hynes? He's had a couple of coaching stops. He was in Nashville. He was in New Jersey. He played at Boston University. So what do we think of they obviously could have just gone the interim route and just tried to kind of piece it together, but he's a guy who, just looking at his numbers, like, he's been to the playoffs a few times, not a lot of playoff success. And if you count the qualifying round, I think he's like 4-15 to overall, and in the playoffs, counting that qualifying round, like 4-15 record. Doesn't seem like it's a guy that you're bringing in to say, hey, we want to get to the next level. This is kind of a guy being brought in, it seems like, to kind of restore a certain level of credibility that they thought they had.
Well, he's familiar to Guerin. Obviously, they both were in the Pittsburgh organization at the same time.
Yep.
Hynes was coaching the American Hockey League affiliate for the Penguins, while Guerin had pretty much just kind of retired as a player, was settling in first as a player development coach, and then he obviously went on to become an assistant GM with the Penguins before eventually joining the Wild. So there's some familiarity there. I think back to, you're right, kind of like he came in, I think, at the Devils. We see now the Devils seem to kind of be on the cusp of maybe their breakout. They're getting better each and every year. And I think a lot of that foundation, of where they're at now was probably started when Hynes was there.
Okay.
They didn't make the playoffs, a lot of those seasons that he was there, but, it's the strides. It's like you said, kind of building an identity and probably restoring a lot of competitiveness. And then he goes on to Nashville. And that, I think, had been a team. You think back to those Central Division games against the Wild in recent years, always a tough out, but, maybe had kind of been looking to recalibrate a little bit since, there was a lot of veterans on that team. But again, just hadn't maybe been able to have that breakthrough performance in a number of years since their lengthy playoff run. So they made the playoffs. Besides that qualifying round in the season that picked up after the COVID-19 interruption, they made the playoffs 2 out of 3 years, and last season didn't make it, which was, we saw how tough that Central Division was. The Wild, Avalanche, and Stars really battling for that top seed late into the season. So Nashville misses out, but again, it's a fresh voice, like you said. A new direction, and it's not early in the season, but it's early enough that I think there's still time on the table to make up some ground. But it obviously starts with this team snapping out of this funk and needing to go on a streak in the other direction and really pick up some points. And to do so in the division, I think, would be a big get for them at this point in time as well.
Love it that Hynes coached New Jersey and Nashville in the same year. Only the NHL, the guy gets fired and then just gets picked up by another team in the middle of the same season. That was the 1920 season. He was both a head coach for the Devils and for the Predators. And then you're right, went from there and had some good years in Nashville, two playoff appearances, quick exits. Last year, they didn't make the playoffs, but they had 92 points. I mean, it was tough last year to get in the West, maybe not as tough this year. Final thought here, Bill Guerin makes this move, I'm sure, in consult with Craig Leopold, the owner. I think Guerin's had the magic touch the last few years. The moves he's made this year, a little bit more questionable. And now you're seeing the Suter Parisi buyouts and kind of the impact of that and just kind of having to live with that. And everybody's known that. But I guess the question now is what if this doesn't work? What if this isn't the thing that turns the Wild season around? And Craig Leopold is not the kind of owner that wants to sit there and miss the playoffs and rebuild. And even though there probably is a school of thought that says, hey, wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to get a top 5 pick every once in a while, but that's not what they want. They want to be in the playoffs every year. That's his stated goal. What if this doesn't work? How patient do you think they'll be with Bill Guerin? How much trust do you think they still have in Bill Guerin?
Well, obviously, he's at the helm and he's trying something. Yeah. We saw that even a few weeks ago. He makes the trade for Zach Bogosian. He tries to address the blue line. They're trying to evolve. They're trying to improve. I get that for sure. But I think the facts are the facts. And I think that's probably what we're going to look back on regardless of what happens. This core is locked in.
Yeah.
Most of this roster is signed long-term, especially after the extensions went out to Foligno, Zuccarello, and Ryan Hartman before the season. So this is the team. That's not going to change. They can make, I guess obviously they can make subtle differences here and there, but these players are locked in. The buyouts are what the buyouts are. The math isn't going to change. And so I know they have not wanted to acknowledge that as an excuse, but it's available and it's there.
Yeah,
and
right.
if this team doesn't make the playoffs, we're going to point to the nearly $15 million that they didn't have able to invest into their roster to, keep the likes of a Kevin Fiala or go sign someone of that type of caliber since, that's now the going rate for elite players in this league. So I think they have some context there that we have to be mindful of. That doesn't necessarily explain the struggles of this season.
Right.
And, like we said, a lot of players are underperforming. There's plenty of runway left in this season for them to adjust. But this is who the Wild are. And they made a change at coach. That's a tool at Guerin's disposal. He utilized it. Now what?
Yeah.
Do they bust with the roster more? Well, there's maybe a little opportunity there. But as we've said, this is the team. This is the core. I think, again, though, the big picture is important. They have a very intriguing pipeline of prospects.
Right.
We've seen some of them this season. A Damon Hunt comes in and doesn't look out of place. And, maybe wasn't supposed to play this early into the season, but obviously, injuries and the cap situation maybe dictated that he arrive, and stand in. So I think all of that is important to keep in mind. They have these young players coming up. They're going to have a lot of money to spend in a few years. But in the meantime, this is their team. These are their restrictions. And let's see what they're capable of doing. They've made the change at coach, which they've had, as I said, as an option available. But now really, I think it's just play and see what happens. You've said, like you pointed out, I mean, this is an organization focused on winning. That's really been the philosophy for Craig Leopold's entire tenure.
Yeah.
As evidenced with, the comings and goings and how we've seen this roster evolve. And I think, players and managers and coaches, they're wired that way. I don't think they're thinking about draft status, picks and stuff. So I don't think that's going to change. But wherever the Wild finish this season, I think the asterisks are going to be clear. This was a team that was missing a lot of money and has had to lose some very helpful players along the way. But there is an opportunity down the road with the addition of their young players and some influx of cash eventually that they could really be in a position to maybe take that next step. What do they do in the meantime? I think that's going to be the big question the rest of the way this year. What do they do in the meantime to set themselves up to have the most success when they have the resources to do so?
Yeah, I agree. And it'll be interesting the rest of this year too. I mean, like I said, they locked themselves into Foligno, Zuccarello, and Hartman, guys who have been productive here, but guys who perhaps could have been, trade pieces if the season truly went off the rails. And again, it's only 19 games. The season's not off the rails. It's off to a bad start. It's off to about as bad of a start as it can be when you get your coach fired. But I wonder if they'll miss that flexibility if they kind of pivot to, hey, let's kind of stockpile some resources. But you're right. That's not how players think, and that's not how Craig Leopold thinks. They want to win right now, and they've got a shot at it. They've got a new head coach, and we'll see if anything changes and if we see a different team on the ice Tuesday when they resume play and we hear more from their new head coach. Sarah McLellan, appreciate it as always. Thanks everybody for checking into this special edition of the show. And Sarah, we'll talk again soon.
Take care.